Hi friends, Molton here and welcome back to this opening video. So I'm going to go over one which I really didn't give much love to initially in my tier list. I put it quite low, but I think that's because I had some really bad experiences with it. I'm going to revisit it. I realized the lines are actually super fun to play and there are some really interesting variations which you can definitely learn from as well. So I'm going to roll the intro, let's get started and we'll learn how to play the Budapest. Okay, so the Budapest Gambit starts with the moves pawn to d4, black plays knight f6, white plays c4, and then black gambits this pawn with the move e5. White captures the pawn. If white doesn't capture the pawn and pushes, then black has a very comfortable position. We can just develop our bishop to c5, put our pawn to d6, and castle kingside with absolutely no problems here. So most people would take the pawn, and this is the most challenging line. Now, we should continue with the move knight to g4. There is a move knight to e4, which is a different gambit, which I know nothing about apart from this one trap which goes like knight f3 and then black plays b6. And here if white goes queen d5, forking the two pieces, there's a trap which goes bishop b7, queen takes, knight c6, and let's say queen a6, knight c5. The queen is trapped. We follow through with a6. But this is pretty much all I know, and I don't think the line is particularly good compared to knight to g4. After knight g4, white has a lot of different options, so we'll cover them one by one. We'll start with probably what I think is the most challenging line, which is the move bishop to f4. So after the move bishop to f4, there's a couple of moves you could play. So one which is played often is the move pawn to g5, especially in rapid and blitz chess, but this one I don't think works out for black that well, because if they drop the bishop back to d2, it might be okay because you can take the pawn, but if they play the move bishop to g3 instead, and after bishop g7 follow through with the move pawn to h4, I find it very difficult for black in this position. White just damages our pawn structure and gets a very healthy advantage. So even though g5 is interesting, we probably can't play it here. Therefore bishop b4 is the preferred move, and after bishop b4 most people will play knight to d2 in order to not allow the doubling of their pawns. And after this we can play the move pawn to d6. In fact, in the line I recommend, I think it's better to actually play the knight c6 move order first, and then we'll reach the same position after d6 later. But for this one, there's another line after d6, pawn takes, and I really wanted to recommend this one, queen to f6, which it looks super fun to play, and I've tried it out in some games, but overall, if white knows what he's doing, it's very difficult here. Like, there are some very tempting moves like g5, and you can go h5. You can also take on b2 here, threatening the knight, threatening the rook, but again, if white just plays correctly, like knight f3, and doesn't blunder any pieces, I feel that white should have a very steady advantage. So as much as I wanted to recommend this, it probably is not enough compensation. So instead, I think it's better just to take the pawn. But again, I think we should play it from the knight c6 move order, so then the knight is already committed to f3. But here we transpose into the game after knight f3, knight c6, and then after e3, I think we can just develop the bishop to f5 and castle queenside with, okay, maybe objectively speaking, white is a little bit better, but black has sort of the typical compensation along the d file, and we can go for some attacking ideas on the king side. So for example, after bishop to e2, in this particular game, black played the move pawn to h5, queen b3 was met by castle's queenside, queen c3. Here black played the move rook e8. So the reason why I played queen c3, I believe, is after castles is probably worried about a move like knight takes h2. Now if knight takes h2, we can capture back this knight on the d2 square. So after queen c3, rook to e8. This still doesn't actually fully stop knight takes h2. That's still a move if white castles. So a3 was played to stop knight b4 ideas. And here black found this move queen h6, which was a very good move. The idea is to threaten some sacrifices on the e3 square. The game continued knight h4, and after bishop to d3 by black, very interesting move as well. The idea is that if takes, we have the move knight takes e3, and the whole white position is collapsing in the center. So knight f1 was played, and the game continued bishop takes, king takes, knight d4 check, king to e1, and after queen f6, hitting the knight and hitting the pawn, white is already forced to resign in 17 moves. Okay, so after bishop to f4, that's what I'm recommending, to go for this line. You can also play knight c6 here, which is what I recommend as the better move order. And if they play knight f3, we'll sort of transpose back into our mainline variation anyway. Some other options on move 4 are the move pawn to e4. So after the move pawn to e4, we should play the move knight takes e5, and after f4 just drop the knight back, and I think black is totally fine here. There's also another very interesting suggestion here, which was given by a chess friend, Bruce Williams. In this position, he's suggested the move pawn to h5, which I quite like this idea as well. So the idea is that if white goes bishop to e2, we can just sacrifice the pawn completely and just play knight c6. And if they take it, allow this sacrifice, and we'll win the pawn back with d6 with an opening of the h file. So I quite like this idea with h5, which you can definitely try out in your games. So instead of e4, there's also a move knight to h3. So this one used to annoy me quite a bit, but I realized that it's probably not as critical as the main move if you know what you're doing. So after knight takes e5, let's say white plays e3. If black responds with the move pawn to g6, white can get like a small nagging edge, but it's still very, very playable for black. For example, after knight f4, bishop to g7, knight to c3, castles. There's a lot of games here for black which continued d6, and here the idea for black is to put the knight on c5. So we play the move pawn to a5, and then we maneuver this knight into the c5 square. Say bishop to b2, rook e8, with maybe bishop f5, c6, a4 ideas, and black is doing absolutely fine here in a couple of games where some strong grandmasters. So if we go back to knight to g4, the main move is of course knight to f3 in this position, and here you have two main options. The first option is knight to c6, which most people will play, but I recommend the second one more. So after this one, bishop to f4, bishop to b4 check, knight to d2, queen to e7. Most people play this for the main trap in this position, which happens after pawn to a3. Black can recapture with knight takes e5, and the idea is that you can't take the bishop because there's a very nice checkmate here on d3. So instead, after knight takes e5, knight takes e5, again you can't capture the bishop because of the same mating threat, and some variations might end up going e3, bishop takes knight, queen takes, pawn to d6, where white is probably slightly better with the bishop pair, but black has a solid enough position. You can also end up with a position after bishop takes e5, bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, queen takes e5, which again white has a little bit more space, but black is solid enough. But this is not what I would recommend. So the line I'm going to recommend instead for black is the more interesting bishop to c5. So after the move bishop c5, white should play the move pawn to e3, and now we go knight c6. So the difference is here the bishop can't get to the f4 square. That's why I think it might be better for white to put the bishop back to f4 immediately. But this is actually more commonly played. After the move knight to c3, castles, bishop to e2, rook to e8, castles, knight takes z5 is the idea, takes, and we get into this position. White usually continues with the move pawn to b3 to develop the bishop to b2, since it can't really come out the other way. And here black shows his idea, which is one of my favorite ideas in this whole entire line, and that is to play the move pawn to a5. After the move pawn to a5, bishop to b2, we swing our rook across and just go rook to a6, and we're just heading straight for checkmate on the king side. And just to highlight exactly how dangerous this idea can be if white just casually doesn't respond, as what happened in one chess.com game online, which went king h1, black followed through with the move rook h6, and after the move f4 was already completely lost because black sacrificed the rook with rook takes h2, king takes h2, queen h4 check, bishop takes e3, the rook had to block, and then we have queen takes f2, and this is forced checkmate since king h1 runs into queen h4. So definitely there's a very serious threat on the line, so after rook a6 white needs to respond. That's why most people here will play the move queen to d5. Now after the move queen to d5, black should play the move bishop to a7, so we don't want to block the rook, so make sure you don't play bishop b6 or anything like that. Here knight e4 was played in a lot of games, opening up an attack on the knight. Now if you want to spend a couple of minutes to try and work out what the best move for black is, feel free to do so, but otherwise I will show you. The move is here to not defend the knight and just go rook h6 anywhere, and this leads to some very aggressive variations here. So for example, one particular game here with Sam Sevian as the black pieces continued bishop takes e5. Here black's idea is to play the move pawn to c6, and now the bishop is undefended, so if you move the queen back we'll just capture the bishop, and this is absolutely fine for black. So instead white throws in this in-between move. He goes bishop to f6, and now things get really wild. So after the move bishop f6 we capture the pawn, capture the bishop, queen to f5 is played, so you can't play d5 here, even though it looks like it's a discovery on the queen, because queen f4 would attack the rook, and this would give white a big advantage. So instead we should play the move bishop to b8. So this prevents queen to f4, also attacks this pawn on h2, also prepares the move pawn to d5. So a very multi-purpose move. Now if knight g3, the game continued pawn to d5, queen to f3, and here black could just continue with the move rook to g6, and let's say h3 you can just play the move king h8 here, slide the king across, follow through with rook g8 with fantastic compensation for black. But in the game Sam went for something even more interesting. He played this move rook to e4. So instead of going for the doubling on the g file, he went for the doubling on the h file. So after the move rook to e4, obviously white can't take this, because then this would lead to some ideas with bishop takes h2, which can get very nasty with the king being open. So instead rook d1 was played, and already after the move rook to h4, now white has to play h3 to defend the h-pawn, and black played this move bishop to g4, so attacking the queen, and things are getting very out of hand here. You have to already sacrifice the queen, because if pawn takes, see if you can spot the winning move here for black. I'll give you a couple of seconds to work it out. Okay, well done to those of you who saw the move rook to h1 check. And after the move knight takes h1, bishop to h2 is checkmate for black. So very nice threat there from black. So after bishop g4, you're in fact forced to sacrifice the queen because the queen has no other squares to go to. So after queen takes g4, rook takes g4, bishop takes g4, the game continued, bishop takes g3. This stops the knight from jumping into the f5 square. It also gives a few weaknesses for black to attack on e3 and g3. After the move pawn takes on g3, we had to move rook to g6, and even though the game is technically still balanced, roughly equal, it's very unclear position and messy enough that white was making a mistake in the next few moves and went on to lose the rest. So if we go back to rook h6, there was another game played with Firouzja, having the black pieces here, where his opponent, instead of taking on e5, took on a5 instead. And after queen takes a5, the game continued, bishop to b6, queen to a8, pawn goes to d6. White played the move pawn to c5 here to try and block out this bishop scope, so then there's no more threats on the e3 pawn. Here Firouzja continued with the move queen to h4, attacking the knight, attacking the pawn on h2. H3 ideas will just be met by sacrifices later on, maybe not right away, maybe you play bishop d7 first and then later play bishop takes h3, could be an idea. So in the game, bishop takes e5 was played, and here we have the move pawn takes e5, and he just sacrifices the bishop here on b6 because he has sufficient threats on the king side. f3 was played. Now after f3 we have the move queen takes h2. Again, he probably didn't push the h3 pawn because he was worried about bishop d7 and bishop takes on h3. So here after queen takes h2, king across, rook g6. I believe this was a classical game as well, or at least an over the board game. After the move rook g6, rook to g1 was played, bishop to d7, queen goes to a3, the bishop went to h3 now. Again, this bishop's trapped anyway, has no squares to go to, so black is trying to make as many threats as he can on the g2 pawn. So bishop f1 was played. Now Firouzja continues with the move pawn to f5, attacking the knight on e4. Queen to a4 was played. We have the move rook to d8. Rook to d1 was played. Very good defensive move. So if we take the rook, the idea is that we get back rank mated here on e8. So instead, rook f8 was played, queen c4 check, king h8, queen f7. So white is really going for black's back rank here. Black just shuffles across to g8. So we don't want to take that queen because of rook d8 check. So now knight g5 was played. So white's threatening the move queen takes rook and then rook d8, sort of like a last ditch effort, but black can just take the knight with rook takes on g5. The game didn't last much longer. Pawn takes b6, takes queen c7, h6. White went for the back rank attack, but it wasn't enough. Rook takes, queen takes, king h7, and white's pieces are just completely stuck here on the king side. The rook and pawns can't move, bishop can't move, and also black is threatening the move pawn to e4 next. So white decided to resign here. So I hope you enjoyed this line and a look into the Budapest Gambit. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Take care.